Lovely day to visit with my friends. Good day to you, friends. How are you today? Seamus here. And as I record this, it is Tuesday, the 5th of January. So, depending on the traditions you keep, Yule ended just a few days ago, and this evening or tomorrow evening will be 12th night. And I thought since that marks the end of the winter holiday season, what a better time than to share a short little winter story with you. Yes, short, I can tell short. This is not a fairy tale, as much as I love saying once upon a time, and it's not even a folk story. This is actually a fable. And I loved fables as a child because I knew there would be a point to the story, a moral, if you will. And for some reason, when I learned this fable, it was told in the first person, so I'll tell it that way just because I can. I hope you enjoy it. This is called The Winter's Horn. Many, many years ago, when I was a very, very young man, I lived in a tiny little hamlet of a place in the middle of nowhere, not a village of any reputation whatsoever. But we had our gate and we had our fence and we had our croft houses and we kept our pigs and we grew our carrots and our wheat and our corn, and we just had a good, happy life, although it was simple beyond simple could ever be. The distinctive feature of our village was that at the gate there was a great huge rock, and it wasn't there on purpose. It wasn't some kind of a marker. It was there because it was there when we built the village. And its only great quality was the fact that it was very big, and on top there was a flat, smooth part. And us younger lads, as we were at the time, always wanted to climb up on top and play around, and, well, you know what silly young boys could be like. But anyway, what matters to our story is that one year, when I was a young lad, something very, very strange happened. And it was just about this time of the year. The winter had been going on for some time, and we had had good winds and we had had our first snow, but it was winter, as winter has always been. And looking down the road one day towards the deep dark woods, which were off in the distance, we saw somebody coming. And as he got closer, we noticed that it was a young boy, only a few years maybe older than me. And as he got closer, we saw that his feet were wrapped in rags, his clothes were tattered and dirty, he had a ratty old blanket pinned around his shoulder like a cloak. His only distinctive feature that we knew of at that moment was that around his neck was a leather cord attached to a bronze horn. And as he got closer and closer, we could tell that he was whistling, and he was offbeat, and there was no rhythm to speak of, and his notes were flat, but he just kept coming closer and closer. And when he got near the gates, we thought he would walk right in, but he didn't. Rather, he stopped, and he climbed up onto the smooth part of that rock, and he stood there looking and catching everyone's eye. And when we were all paying attention, he gave a great big, it would have been a toothy grin. But we noticed immediately that the middle two teeth, top and bottom, were gone. And someone called out, "Where's your teeth, boy?" And he says, "It's for my horn." And with that, he pulled the horn up into his hand, raised it above his head, gave us all that big, goofy grin, and said, "With this horn, I shall bring upon you the most bitter of winters you have ever known." And we all laughed and called him a fool, and he just nodded his head and smiled and brought that horn down to his mouth, and he blew that horn and made a noise such as we had never heard before. There was no tune, there was no music to it. It sounded somewhat like you might hear if two cats were fighting each other while rolling around in a mud puddle. It was just a horrific noise, and we all stopped and suddenly paid attention. And we thought about what he said, and we thought about the horn, and we looked at the state of him, and we all began to laugh, and, "Oh, you're a fool, go away with you, go on now, leave us in peace, go." And two of the larger men from the village moved towards the rock, and the young fellow hopped down and took his horn in his hand and began to run, and they began to run, and he ran like his life depended on it, until he was further from the village than he was closer to the woods, and at that point he turned, and he gave that big silly grin, and he disappeared off into the deep dark forest. But as the day grew on, and the fool was gone, we kept thinking about what he said. And we thought how, with him having nothing to show for himself, yet still he had a strange confidence. Perhaps there was a little bit of magic in it. And as the day got shorter and the night began to settle in, we got to thinking that maybe, just maybe, he was right. That night, we listened for the wind to get stronger. It didn't. We watched for the snow to get deeper, and it didn't. But still, for the next several days, we were wary. We were wondering what might be. But the days continued to grow a bit longer, and the light got a bit brighter, and soon it was time for planting, and of course we had forgotten all about the fool. Until the following winter. And you know what happened. One day, 3 weeks, maybe a month into wintertime, we're doing our things in the village. We're taking care of our critters. We're bringing in the last little bit of kale from the cowyard. And sure enough, one of the men at the gates calls out, "He's back." And we look, and down the road that leads towards the deep, dark woods, sure enough, we saw this little figure. tawny-headed, scruffy-looking, ratty old blanket flapping in the breeze. And as he got closer and closer, we could hear the whistling, and the whistling wasn't any better than it was the year before. And sure enough, he got to the point that he was approaching the gate, and up he climbed onto that rock and up onto that flat, smooth spot that we used to play on. And he stood there and he waited until we all started to get quiet because we knew what was coming. And he looked us all in the eye and he smiled that big gap-toothed grin, and he pulled the horn up above him and he said, "With this horn, this winter's horn, I will bring upon you the bitterest winter that you've ever known." And he blew the horn. Well, we had no patience for him. Immediately, some of the men moved towards the rock, and we were calling him fool, and some of the older women were pelting him with rotten fruit, and down off the rock he went, and he took off at a run, and the men chased him. And about halfway to the forest, he stopped, and he turned, and he smiled, and disappeared into the deep, dark forest. And friends, this went on for years. And as he was growing, so I was growing. As he got older, I got older. And though he was a few years older than me, I had become elder of my village. And this story went on every winter. This fool would come and climb on the rock and make his threat and blow his horn and disappear. But then one year, when I had become elder of the village, and one of the men at the gates called out, "He's coming." And we looked, and sure enough, shambling up the road from the deep, dark forest was an old, bent, wizened figure with what had once been tawny hair, now with a bent back and spindly legs. There was no whistling to speak of. He couldn't draw enough breath. And when he got close to the gate, some of the younger fellows felt so bad that they actually helped the old man, the old fool, up onto the top of the rock. And he stood there and he planted his feet. And before he could say anything, I said, no, we're done with this. Every year you come and threaten. Every year nothing happens. You're just a fool wasting our time. We've got enough to do. Leave. And he says, "I cannot leave. I must blow my horn and speak my words." And he raised up the horn and said, "With this horn, this winter's horn." And with that, he lost his balance and fell backwards off the rock and landed with a resounding thump on the frozen ground. And I ran to him. And it's my sad duty to report that the fool was stone dead. Well, there's nothing for it. I turned to a couple of the younger fellows by the gate, and I told them to take him and wrap him up and take him back into the deep, dark woods that seemed to be his home, and bury him deep, and whatever they do, get rid of that horn. And life went on, and the day continued. And as the sun was beginning to set, I took my walk around the village as I was known to do. And as I made my way out onto the roadway a little bit to the two tall oak trees that marked the beginnings of our village path, I looked down, and laying in the middle of the path was the horn. Now, I know the fool had been buried. I trusted the men that did the job, but there's his horn laying in the road between the two tall trees. And as I watched, the horn began to roll back and forth. And I thought that was incredibly strange. So I stepped closer. And as I stepped closer, I thought I heard the fool's whistling, which I knew couldn't happen because he was dead. And as I leaned in to pick the horn up, that whistle turned into a bit of a caterwaul like the horn used to make. And as I picked the horn up, the wind began to grow and rise and whistle through the trees. And I knew that something was coming like I had never known before. And I picked the horn up and I watched as the wind built and the trees began to shake and the clouds rolled in. And as quickly as I could straighten my old spine and my old feet could carry me towards the gate, I called out to the village, "Go to your homes, go to your homes, the storm is coming." And everyone fled. No one questioned it. They made their way in and they barred the door and they shuttered the windows and they built up their fires and they hunkered in. And sure enough, the wind came roaring through like we had never felt it before. And the snow came in, not in a gentle flurry, but it came in like a fury. And the snowdrifts began to build and build, and before full dark, the snow was up to some of our windows. And we passed that night hunkered down inside with the doors barred and the fires built up, and we waited. And that wind howled for 3 days. It snowed all night long. Snow higher than we had ever seen before. Wind yelling and howling like we had never heard before. And on the morning of the third day, some of us ventured out, dug the snow away from our doors and cleared some of our windows and did what we could do to take care of each other. And that year, something changed. And there was a lesson to be learned. And as the days lengthened and the sun shone brighter and the springtime came and it was time to open the fields for crops, I spent one morning sitting beside a newly opened stream, bathing my feet in the cool water. And I thought how the fool had never learned his lesson, is that the winter must announce itself and only the winter can say when it's done, and it's up to the winter to blow its own horn. But more importantly, that winter, we all learned a lesson, the moral of the story, if you will, which is that when you're facing something that you have never faced before, perhaps the best thing that you can do is hunker in close with those you love and simply ride out the storm. I do thank you for joining me this morning, my friends. I hope to be with you before the end of the month with a nice story for Robbie Burns. But until then, please be kind to each other, take good care of each other, and we'll see you soon. Cheers.